Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host, Simon. I'm here, one of my writers. In this case, David. Thank you so much, David's written me a script. I've never read it before. Luis Garavito, the most prolific serial killer in human history. Oh, this is a great way to ruin my Tuesday afternoon, isn't it? Why can't we just be doing a heist where it said, no, he's the most prolific. How have I never heard of this guy? Didn't, what's his Shipman? David Shipman kill like 160 people or something? Isn't that like way up there in the annals of serial killer history? How many did this guy people kill? How many people did this guy kill? How have I never heard of him? Anyway, let's jump into it. Just before we get started with today's episode, it's Simon from the future here. Hello. I've got some excellent news. In this episode, you'll find out that today's protagonist gets eye cancer. Oh no. And guess what? Since we recorded it, he died. And you might think that, oh, that's not very classy, Simon. That's not very nice of you to say that someone's got eye cancer and died for it. Well, my friend, watch this episode and then, like me, rather than being like, oh no, he got eye cancer and died, you'll be like, oh no, he got eye cancer and died. What a shame. What a giant shame. No need to break out a cigar. Fuck that guy. It was the afternoon of the 7th of November 1998 in Pereira, Colombia, a small city in the foothills of the Andes and part of Colombia's fertile coffee-producing region known as the Coffee Axis. How creative. A group of local children were playing football in a field. At one point, a young boy chased the football into the corner of allotment. Oh no, please, no. David, you did the Pedro Lopez episode, didn't you? Did you write Pedro Lopez, David? I have a feeling you did. Why? What? Can't he just be like the most prolific serial killer in history who just killed bad guys like that guy Dexter from the TV show Dexter? Why can't we just have it like that? It's like, no, he murdered children after doing horrible things to them. And there goes my monetization for the episode. Why do I do this to myself? Hello everyone, before we continue with today's video, I have something special to share with you, and that is our fantastic sponsor, Sheath Underwear. Sheath creates incredibly, ridiculously comfortable boxer briefs that I swear by. My entire underwear drawer at home, top left, my sock drawer's on the right, it's a little bit depleted, but my underwear drawer is stuffed full of Sheath. Look, if you're tired of boxers that are too loose or briefs that are too tight, Sheath is the perfect middle point. Look, I'm wearing Sheath right now. I've got a pair right here to show you, and they are absolutely the best. Once you got a pair, you'll buy one pair, and then you'll be like, oh, I get it, and then you'll order more, and then your entire drawer will be filled with Sheath underwear, and your life will be perfect, not a guarantee. These boxer briefs feature stretchy fabric with moisture-wicking technology, providing a soft and cool experience. They're a game changer. Whether it's scorching summer or cool winter, they are perfect. They've got a unique dual pouch system, so all your man parts are kept separate, which avoids sticking, it avoids discomfort, it's just better. Or if you're not feeling that day, just wear them as regular underwear. It's perfect. Plus, it's a great gift. Imagine giving a gift of pure comfort and style, and they've just introduced new seasonal designs. Additionally, they've launched a new bamboo women's line, so that's for you ladies. But that's not all. They also have base layers for chilly winter days, so you can stay cozy while braving the cold. So go to sheathunderwear.com and get the most comfortable underwear you'll ever wear. And here's a gift. Use the promo code CRIMINALIST for 20% off your order. You can find the link in the video description, or just go to sheathunderwear.com and use the code CRIMINALIST to revolutionize your underwear game. And now back to today's video. By the way, I'll say it right here. Thank you, everybody, because I didn't even realize that. I turned on something called Super Thanks because my dude at YouTube was like, turn on Super Thanks. And I was like, okay. So he walks me through and he's like, go into settings, go on to monetize and click on Super Thanks. And I didn't think much about it. I didn't think much about it at all. And then I saw this option in YouTube Studio to see like Super Thanks, people who had given Super Thanks. Holy shit! It's a lot of money. Thank you so much. Some guy gave me $500. Like, what the f***? You legend. Thank you. I should remember your name, but I won't. And honestly, I won't shout you out. Although if you're giving a Super Thanks, you want it, don't you? Because it's under your little YouTube name. Let me just find that, if I can find that. Oh, do I have the old version of YouTube Studio installed? This dude, Mitchell Sanford, you f***ing legend. He gave me $499.99. I literally was like, oh yeah, dollars. That must be like, I don't know, Mexican dollars or whatever. So it's actually like 60p. But no, this guy did. Amazing. Thank you so much. And it's just endless reams of people giving me money. It's crazy. Thank you. At one point, a young boy chased a football into the corner of the allotment where he spotted a human skull. When the police arrived, they noted it was too small to be a man's, and therefore they speculated that the skull was a woman's. But as the rest of the skeleton was excavated, forensics quickly determined that the bones belonged to a boy who had been on the cusp of puberty between the ages of 11 and 13. Oh God, here we go. David, you've done it again, haven't you? He even sent me an email being like, "Simon, brace yourself. I know Pedro Lopez stayed with you, and this is another one." And I was like, this is the last one. I have like a list of casual criminalists that I need to record, and this one's been sitting on the bottom for ages. Not because I don't want to not because I'm not going to how do I phrase this? I love David's writing, but oh my God, I wasn't really looking forward to this. Also, once in one of my earliest YouTube videos, I said skeleton as skellington, and for years, people would be like, skellington, The death of a child that age was hardly surprising in 1990s Colombia, where decades of civil war, political upheaval, and struggles with ruthless drug cartels had created a class of homeless street urchins known as the disposables. Although half of Colombia's children lived in poverty and 10% of them had no formal education whatsoever, the disposables were in the direst straits of all. There were approximately 60,000 disposables in Colombia, with 20,000 of them living in the nation's capital of Bogotá. The rest of them were spread out in other cities across the country. The disposables spent their young lives on the streets. They got into drugs, smoking cheap cocaine residue as young as 6. Both boys and girls got into prostitution at ages as shockingly young as 9. The boys ran with gangs, they engaged in street violence, and even committed murders of other children, usually bludgeoning each other to death with clubs and chains or stabbing each other with knives and broken bottles. You know your society's a complete and utter failure when this is happening, right? All societies at some level are a failure. They fail some people. But when there's this level of failure, where it's, what's happening? Well, we've got a class of children that we call disposable, and they go around murdering each other and smoking cocaine. You'll be like, is this in the dystopian future or the far distant past? No, this is the 90s. Get out, Colombia. Get your together. And I think you did right. Colombia's now much better than it once was. Sometimes they were killing each other over nothing more than the best sleeping spots. They had no family to claim them or protect them. Thus, they were prime target for adult predators or guerrillas who wished to press gang them as child soldiers, or cartels who wished to use them as drug mules. If the disposables disappeared or were killed, very few people would notice. And because these children usually had never visited a dentist a day in their lives, their bodies, should they ever be found, could not even be identified by dental records. And so, the body of the boy found in a field in Pereira was not assigned a high priority by the police. Odds are they'd never even learn what his name was. Yeah. And another sign of a failed state is where your police are like, "Ours is child's skull." Yeah, we're never going to crack that one, are we, boys? Back to the donuts. But perhaps the police should have paid closer attention. Lately, people across Colombia had become alarmed by a spike in the rate of child disappearances. Not just of the disposables, but children with parents and families too. Panicked mothers and fathers wondered where their children were. In the past year, dozens of children have been reported missing from the city of Pereira alone. A similar uptick in disappearances had occurred across the country. If that happened to me, and makes my skin crawl even just thinking about it, I'll be like, police, all right, let's go find some, I just watched that movie Knives Out last night, and I'll be like, I'm going to go find my, Raymond Blanc or whatever his name was. Wait, isn't that a chef? Bertrand Blanc or whatever. James Bond's character from that movie. Daniel Craig. I'll be like, I'm just going to go find the most expensive one of these people. I'm going to hire him, and then I'm going to pay him until he finds out what's wrong. And then I'm going to give all that information to the police because they didn't want to do their jobs. A similar uptick in disappearances had occurred across the country, and then on November the 15th, 1998, police uncovered a mass grave of 36 children in Pereira. Combined with other smaller dump sites, the total number of bodies leapt up to 41. Over the coming months, an additional 27 children were found in a mass grave in Cauca Valley to the south. Further reports of dump sites and mass graves poured in from other parts of Colombia, setting off a countrywide investigation. At first, the police entertained the theory that these children were victims of a satanic society or a trafficking ring. That would make sense. If you found this, you'd be like, gangs. What's the Colombia famous for? Drugs and gangs. And there's dead children, gangs and drugs. That's what you'd assume, right? But the bottles of lubricant and cheap brandy invariably found at each burial site convinced police that they were looking at the work of one man, a prolific serial killer. Police considered this might be the handiwork of Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes, who had killed an estimated 200 to 300 children in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador in the space of just a few years. Again, Fucking hell. Holy my God. Lopez had been released from a Colombian mental institution just 9 months earlier on $50 bail on a condition that he continued his psychiatric treatment and reported his activities monthly to a judge. Pedro Lopez checks in. Morning, Judge. Hello, Pedro. How's it going? Good. What have you been up to this month? Oh, a little bit of child murder. Nothing big. It's just a small little extra bit I did. Fucking Pedro Lopez. Yeah, there were numerous things about the killings that ruled out Lopez as a suspect. First of all, some of the bodies found in the mass graves had been there for a while and were obviously killed prior to Lopez's release. Second, Lopez primarily targeted young girls, but the bodies in the new mass graves were overwhelmingly young boys, ages 6 to 13. Thirdly, the modus operandi did not match. Pedro Lopez's MO primarily consisted of sexual assault and strangulation. These new bodies showed signs of intense torture and grievous bodily harm prior to death, along with severe mutilations post-mortem. Oh my God, David, is this worse than Pedro Lopez? David, why? The victims were beaten, bludgeoned, burned, slashed, stabbed, impaled, disemboweled, castrated, and decapitated. And that is all the detail that I want to give on the subject. Yeah, it's enough detail. Oh my God. Needless to say, these boys perished in the most horrific and painful way imaginable. This wasn't Lopez. It was the work of an entirely new monster. And while I don't want to rank monsters, because Lopez is the greatest piece of that we've ever covered on this channel, although he's got some competition, doesn't he? But this seems worse. I will not bury the lead. When the perpetrator of these crimes was eventually caught, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. But due to Colombian constitutional constraints at the time, which also outlawed the death penalty, the man could only serve a maximum of 40 years. That. I don't understand. Some other countries have this as well, where there's a cap on the most amount of time someone can spend in prison. And it's that's stupid, isn't it? How about we just throw away that rule for people who've murdered multiple children? Literally dozens, perhaps hundreds. This sentence maximum has since been extended to 60 years, but only for subsequent convictions. Meanwhile, the man who filled all of those mass graves had given a full confession and assisted police in finding even more bodies. As a result, his sentence was cut down to just 22 years imprisonment. He spent the last 2 decades locked up at La Tramcua, the notorious maximum security prison in Valledupar, and kept in perpetual solitary confinement due to the fact that he would almost certainly be murdered by the other inmates. If I was a guard in that prison, I'll be like, oh no, I let him out. I didn't realize he wasn't supposed to go in Gen Pop. Who would have thought that he'd be killed in 4 seconds? The Beast. As he has come to be known, applied for early release from prison in 2021 but was denied by the judge on grounds that he could not afford the monetary fine that he still owed for the murders. It's not like inmates make much from labour in a Colombian prison, but as of 2023, the Beast has reached the end of his sentence and become eligible for release. At the time of writing, he could be let out of prison at any moment, either in late 2023 or sometime in 2024. Honestly, though, my favourite theory about Pedro Lopez, because he also got out for some reason, and then he disappeared, is how long do you really think you're going to survive on the outside? You've killed hundreds of children. Someone out there is going to be I'm going to have him killed because that guy. For his part, the Beast is eager to get out in public again. He's spoken in several interviews over the years of his desire to get married and start a family. He also wants to become a religious preacher. The Beast is also considering a run for Congress so he can pass laws that help abuse children. In the same interviews, the Beast has demonstrated next to no remorse for his crimes and usually finds a way to minimize what he's done, blaming it on his own upbringing, his mental illnesses, the devil, and alcohol. I don't care. I don't care about your upbringing. I don't care about your mental illnesses or the devil or alcohol. You should never be released. And if that's the only one there that is anything remotely resembling an excuse is mental illness, and we'll obviously wrap the devil into mental illness because the devil is not real. And in that case, you need to be put in a psychiatric facility for the rest of your life with no release. In 2016, he said to a visibly disgusted interviewer, John Sistiaga, that I have committed a series of behaviors that violate criminal laws and moral norms. I am a human being equal to any other, with some flaws, but not one that is dangerous. Are you smoking the crack? You're in prison for multiple murders of children, with torture on top, with some flaws. You're the biggest piece of shit you ever lived. Someone should start a crowdfunding campaign to hire a hitman to kill you. As soon as you step out of those prison gates. Not that I'd wish death on anyone, that's just an interesting thought experiment. As you continue to listen to today's episode, you can decide for yourself whether you think this man should ever be released from prison. No! I already know the answer to that question, David. The answer is no. Let him burn in prison forever. Wait, he doesn't burn in prison. I mean, if the prison burned down, it wouldn't be the worst thing. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of innocent people in prison. And also people who've just what do you do? A little bit of fraud. I'm not saying that guy should be burned in prison, but this guy, it'd be nice if he did. And I have observed that some people have been sending their opinions, helpfully translated via Google into Spanish, to the Attorney General of Colombia, who can be found on Twitter at Fiscalia Col, that's spelled Fiscaliacol. There is also an official government website with further contact information. Note to Simon, this is probably the last opportunity that we have to plug the history of sex before things get any darker, as if that's humanly possible. I realize I'm not supposed to be reading this, but I'm going to continue it because it's a nice segue into talking about David's book. If you haven't already done it at the top of the episode, I haven't, David. The book comes out on October the 5th. That's 2 days away. Oh, I wrote it. I don't remember what it's called. The foreword to this book, which may even be past the date of this video's release. Also, here's a purchase link. Though the book, well, that's not going to work in the audio format, but let's make sure that is in the link in the description below. Though the book can be ordered through Amazon and most other retailers. It's called Sex by David Baker. History of Sex by David Baker. Let me go get it. I just stubbed my toe terribly. Here it is. David, you are blameless in the toe-tubbing affair. This is the history of sex. 2 billion years of procreation and recreation. David Baker with a foreword by... You know who wrote the last foreword? David wrote a book previously, A Short History of... No, that's Bill Bryson, isn't it? The shortest history of the universe. Sorry. And the previous foreword was written by John Green. Bit of a step down from this one, isn't it, David? Written by Simon Whistler. This is a fantastic book. It's a brilliant read. I've obviously read it because I wrote the foreword and I talk about it. And support David and get his book. All right? It's out in 2 days. It'll absolutely be out by the time you see this episode. Thanks, David. Meet Luis Garavito. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born to Manuel Antonio Garavito and Rosa Delia Cubillos on January the 25th, 1957. In case you are wondering, at the time of writing, this makes the Beast of La Tramquois currently 66 years old. If Garavito is released in 2023 or 2024, and if the eye cancer he has recently developed doesn't spread and kill him first. That would be a great shame, wouldn't it? Oh, Jesus Christ. I feel like eye cancer is the sort of where God's punishing you for something. It's like, we got butt cancer, eye cancer. It's those ones where it's like, oh no, eye cancer. This is young enough to potentially give Garavito a good couple of decades running amok in public before he dies of old age. Garavito was born in the small country town of Genova, located within Colombia's coffee axis. Oh, my toe is really painful. I really stubbed it badly. The Colombian conflicto broke out in 1964 when the government was challenged by both right and left paramilitary groups, in itself a sequel to the Violencia period, which had tormented the childhood of Pedro Lopez a decade earlier. As such, the Garavitos were forced to move to a tiny hamlet of Ceylan in the Cauca Valley. Luis Garavito was the eldest son and second born of 7 children, 4 boys, 3 girls. We are largely dependent on Garavito himself for the details of his childhood, and there is good reason to believe Garavito may have exaggerated some of the negative aspects of his upbringing to provide an excuse for his later criminal behavior. However, we must also allow for the likely possibility that at least some of his account is truthful, since the overwhelming majority of serial killers come from abusive homes. Lacking an independent source from this period, since no comprehensive and reliable account has been given by his family members, we shall never know for certain. According to Garavito, his father, Manuel Antonio, was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his children and did not allow them to have friends or associate with people outside of the family. Which, I mean, all of this sounds shit. It all sounds shit. And it's like, oh yeah, he did have a rough upbringing, so that's okay then. No, it's not okay. Plenty of people have horrible upbringings and they don't murder hundreds of children. Or however many he ends up killing. If he said it was the most ever, then, oh, well, maybe it's not all children, but come on. It's not an excuse. He also heaped verbal abuse upon his children, in particular Garavito, calling him an idiot, a weakling, an imbecile, and a bastard. The last of these insults may have been literal, since Manuel and Rosa seem to have had a fractured relationship almost from the start of their marriage. Manuel was allegedly an adulterer who never shared a bed with his wife, but spent his time having affairs with other women and sleeping with prostitutes. Rosa allegedly retaliated with occasional affairs of her own, but a Catholic marriage in mid-20th century Colombia did not exactly leave open much possibility for divorce. Yes, which is a bit silly, isn't it? So the religion's so stupid sometimes. Manuel's physical and verbal abuse was so spontaneous and unrelenting, the children often hid from their father when he got home from work. Garavito recalls that Manuel was so strict and so harsh that there rarely was a day when you could speak, play, or laugh in his presence without fear of a beating. Garavito said, quote, "We could not develop in a way that children should." Furthermore, despite never sharing a bed with his wife, Manuel would sometimes sleep in the same bed as his children. I mean, that can be like, last night I slept in the same bed as my children because I'm sleeping in bed and I just wake up and my kid's next to me and it's like, oh. The other day, I was just like, oh God, I don't want to talk about this because it's so like, how can you talk about these things so close together? But it's like, I'm just sleeping in bed and it's just the middle of the night. And my youngest son, he's sleeping in the other room. And at some point, my wife has gone to like look after him or whatever because he's had a cry or something. And then I just wake up in the night and my daughter, who's like nearly 4 years old, is just next to me. And I wake up and I'm like, oh, hello. And she's like, I love you, Dad. And I'm like, oh, why are you saying this just now? It's so sweet. And I give her a hug and we just sleep hugging. Oh, God, I don't like talking about this because it's like we're just about to get into something so horrible. Oh, no. According to Garavito, his father may have molested him, quote, "He slept with me and he bathed me. I have a vague memory. It was at night, and he kind of fondled me and touched my private parts. I never loved that man. I saw him as an executioner. Holy Manuel and Rosa frequently got into shouting matches, throwing around insults of quote-unquote high caliber. According to Garavito, when things turned physical, the domestic abuse between Rosa and Manuel was reciprocal, with the two adults beating on each other with equal frequency, but due to basic sexual dimorphism, Rosa often lost the fight. Garavito claims he was the only one to try and defend her, which further provoked the wrath of his father upon him. Garavito alleges that at age 6 or 7, when he endeavored to defend his then pregnant mother from being beaten too severely by his father, Manuel dragged his son outside, strapped him to a tree, and flogged the boy repeatedly with the flat side of a machete. Oh my good lord. According to Garavito, Rosa was also violent with her children. Although alcohol was not the source of her aggression, she didn't drink. Rosa was angry and contemptuous, resentful of her lot in life, and she took out her frustrations on little kids who couldn't defend themselves. According to Garavito, Rosa generally neglected her children, viewed them as an inconvenience and a burden, and raised them with, quote, little affection or care. Garavito began school at the age of 7 after his family had relocated to Ceylon. It proved to be little respite from his home life. He had to wear glasses, for which he was teased by his classmates. Children are mean. He also had the nickname Garavito, which means squiggle, but the hurtfulness of the epithet among children doesn't exactly translate. Yeah, I'm like, that doesn't sound like a bad nickname. That sounds kind of fun. I'd like the nickname Squiggle. He played quietly by himself during recess. According to Garavito's teachers, he was an attentive student, but wasn't too bright and struggled with certain subjects. That's the worst way to be. I'd always rather be like the bright student who doesn't really pay attention rather than the good student who pays attention but isn't that bright, because paying attention is something you can fix. Brightness is not. I was just a student who wasn't particularly bright or paid attention. Eventually, Garavito responded to the bullying with fits of anger, often him turning violent. Sometimes this scared off the other students, sometimes it got Garavito mercilessly beaten up by a gaggle of them. When he wasn't exploding in fits of anger, Garavito maintained the shy silence that kept him from receiving too many beatings at home. In 1967, when Garavito was 10 years old, he gained the first inkling that he might be same-sex attracted. Another boy at school innocently touched Garavito, and he recalled feeling a, quote, pleasant sensation he did not understand and a longing to remain at the boy's side. There is some ambiguity about whether Garavito was homosexual or bisexual. Garavito insists that he is attracted to women, but his fairly sexless relationships with future girlfriends and his perpetual erectile dysfunction would beg to differ. It is possible that, being a product of his culture and the times, Garavito felt pressured to be attracted to women and remains half-closeted to this day. Even so, while Garavito insists he is attracted to women, he is, quote, much more attracted to men. Though the use of the term men might be stretching it, Garavito has stated that the primary objects of his desires throughout his life were early adolescent boys. Quote, "If I saw a young man, let's say 13 or 14 years old, I subconsciously felt but understood that I liked that child and that I wanted to caress him." Bruh. Your brain is broken, my dude. It should be noted that Garavito did not rule out children much younger than 13 or 14. In 1968, Garavito was taken out of school with only a 5th grade education due to his poor academic performance and because his father wanted to help him earn money for the family. As unpleasant as certain aspects of his school life had been, this placed him at his father's mercy almost full-time. But allegedly, Manuel was not the only abuser that he had to worry about. Garavito claims that at the age of 12 or 13, he was repeatedly abused by a neighbor. The man was allegedly a friend of his father's, deeply religious, and the owner of a local drugstore. The abuse would allegedly happen whenever Manuel took his son there to receive flu shots and medication. Garavito claims that the neighbor strapped him down to a bed, burned him with candle wax, cut him with a knife, and bit him on the genitals and buttocks during the sexual assaults. According to Garavito, the bites were apparently so hard that they did lasting damage to his penis. The sessions were allegedly not isolated, but happened with some regularity. Garavito claims that he did not tell his parents about the ongoing sadistic abuse because they would not have believed him. Weigh those comments for what they are worth. Yeah, just had a discussion with my wife about this the other day. I hate that I keep talking about my children in an episode like this, but it's like, yeah, you gotta we were like, well, how do you... Because you don't want your kid to be in this situation because, obviously, if you're telling your parents that something dodgy is happening to you, you want the kid to feel completely competent and confident that they can tell you about that stuff. And my wife and I were talking about, well, how do you do that? How do you I'm sure that there's going to be articles. Google is amazing. You just ask Google or ChatGPT, how do I do this? And it always gives you a great answer. We were wanting to teach. I'm going to stop talking about my children because it's so horrible what's going on. The similarity of the alleged assault by the neighbor to Garavito's later MO has led some criminal psychologists to believe that Garavito invented these facts for his own sexual gratification during his sessions with mental health experts. Instead of Garavito relating a childhood trauma, he was enjoying the impromptu fabrication of erotic fiction. Others suggest these events may have been genuine, shaping Garavito's view of sexuality and blurring the lines between sex and violence in his mind, and thus Garavito may have felt compelled to replicate them to achieve sexual gratification in later life. Garavito claims that the initial insistence of his neighbor's abuse awakened a desire to hurt animals. Well, just we're playing serial killer early life bingo today, aren't we? Jesus. Quote, "The only thing I wanted at that moment is to have self-deleted myself." That's all. Thank you, David. We can't say that word on YouTube because then we get demonetized, which is a bit silly, but it's the world we live in. I'm sorry for all the podcast listeners. Podcasting, they don't give a shit. You can talk about whatever you want. YouTube are like, yo. If you say that self-deletion word, no money for you, fact boy. And the reality is I need money because these are quite expensive to produce. They're quite long. "Then I saw 2 little birds and I stoned them to death. I took the little birds, opened them, and tore them to pieces. That was after my sexual assault. I was very sorry. I don't know why I did it." Shortly after the neighbor's regular abuse began, Garavito claims that he, as a 12-year-old, molested a 6-year-old boy. Garavito also claims that around this time he began to assault his brothers. Quote, "My brothers and sisters were very young, and I felt something inside that I couldn't explain. We all went to bed, where I suggested they take off their clothes, and I began to fondle them. Nothing happened. Neither did my parents find out, nor did my brothers remember. Also, sometimes when they were sleeping, I would again take off my brothers' clothes and fondle them." Bruh. The drugstore owner's abuse of Garavito allegedly continued unabated approximately for 2 years. Then in 1971, when Garavito was 14, the family moved to the town of Trujillo, also in the Caucasus Valley. It was there that Garavito claims he was sexually assaulted by another neighbor. Apparently, this man had shown Garavito heterosexual pornography. When Garavito recoiled in disgust, the neighbor allegedly beat the teenager before dragging him outside into the bushes and sodomizing him. Once again, it's unclear whether this incident actually happened or where Garavito invented it as both an explanation for his later crimes and as a form of sadomasochistic erotica to titillate himself while he spoke to psychologists. Garavito is a classic case of antisocial personality disorder. He is highly manipulative and a chronic liar. You can't rely on a word he says. Aren't highly manipulative chronic liars generally quite intelligent? Because it takes a lot to keep your lies straight, and it takes a lot to manipulate people, because people are generally not that dim. Don't you have to be smarter than someone else to really be able to manipulate them, or just really excellent at manipulation. Either way, in 1972, Garavito's personal narrative sees him transform from a traumatized victim into a relentlessly aggressive predator. Especially because at the age of 15, Garavito encountered another pastime that would be crucial to the contortion of his psyche and to the flourishing of his MO. The demon drink. Alexandra, a friend of mine and charismatic star of Drunken Ghost Hunters, which is, that is a niche reference. If you're new to this show, I have another show called Decoding the Unknown, and David recently wrote an episode called Drunken Ghost Hunters about him and his mate Alexandra, and another dude whose name I can't remember. I'm sorry, other dude. And that's the reference that you're missing there. And said to me, David, nothing turns a good mind bad and a bad mind worse than liquor. 15 minutes later, someone allegedly keyed the side of her ex-boyfriend's car in an elaborate swirly pattern, and 20 minutes after that, Alexandra vomited in the ladies' toilets at the local uni bar and needed to be taken home. Oh my god. Alcohol was certainly fuel for the already festering mind of Luis Garavito. Because of its depressive, agitating, and disinhibitory qualities, booze is foremost among the mind-altering drugs that are capable of exacerbating personality disorders and various forms of mental illness. I was just having a chat with someone the other day about that, and some people, and I've got mates who are I don't really nowadays. I'm a middle-aged man. We don't drink that much. But when I was a kid, we'd drink, and some people, when I'm drunk, I don't get aggressive. I'm just like, hey, woo. Yeah. But some people, they get into fights and stuff, and it's yeah, let's go, and I'm like, oh my god, I'd never been in a fight in my life. If I was drunk and in a fight, it'd be like, what are you supposed to do? With the assistance of a dozen beers or half a bottle of the hard stuff, thoughts and impulses that might have stayed buried are brought to the forefront and enacted in real life. Yes, that's true, though. It's how many beers are 12? What should we do? Anything we want! Except for fighting. Garavito is not even close to being the first alcoholic serial killer. The connection is quite common. For instance, Jeffrey Dahmer always needed to get faced to throttle the life out of his drugged up and helpless victims. Eileen Warner sometimes knocked back 20 beers in a single day while she was hitchhiking and murdering men on the road. And Ted Bundy, in his early murders, needed to get similarly blottoed on Mickey's big mouth malt liquor to carry out acts of abduction and sexual sadism. Yeah. Jesus, I'm just getting reminded of all the horrible that we've covered on this channel. But with Bundy, as time wore on, the impulse got stronger and stronger, and the need for a disinhibitory liquid got weaker and weaker. Garavito, on the other hand, never lost the need for booze in order to reveal the monster that lay beneath. He was a Jekyll and Hyde situation. Even as an adult, he was timid and well-mannered when sober, but he turned into a torturer, murderer, mutilator, and necrophile while drunk. But all that lies ahead, so bruh, quit drinking. It's sometimes you just got to. I haven't drunk for drunk more than a glass of wine for 4 or 5 months now, because I take a pill for my cholesterol, and I went in for my routine blood checkup to make sure it's not destroying my liver. And they were like, guess what, fact boy? It's not doing wonders for your liver. And I was like, oh God. And they're like, do you drink? And I'm like, of course I drink. I'm a normal person. And they're like, no more drinking, or maximum 1 drink a day. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I just it's hard just to drink 1 drink a day, so I mostly just stop drinking, which is weird. I don't feel any better for it. I just feel normal. Just the same as, this is one of my problems. It's I'll eat whatever I want, I'll drink as much as I want, and it's I just don't feel any different. So I'm oh no. Obviously if I get super wasted, I'm going to wake up with a hangover, but only since my 30s, and generally it just doesn't affect my functioning. Yeah, so that's been fun. Got a blood test next week to see if my liver's back on track. As a 15-year-old boy, Garavito had early access to alcohol, eventually gravitating toward cheap brandy since Colombia is the land of the grape rather than the grain. His father drank heavily, which allowed Garavito to sneak a bit of household booze for himself, and in the 1970s, attitudes towards teenage drinking were more relaxed, so a young person could acquire a bottle of liquor from a store more easily, provided they'd scraped together the money. Additionally, even when I was a kid in the early 2000s, late 90s, getting alcohol was kind of a challenge. It usually had to come from someone's parents' house or from some kid who looked particularly old. We always managed, though. We always found a way.
Life finds a way.
Additionally, Colombian drinking culture involves more moderate consumption, with even preteens sometimes being given small amounts of wine with dinner. Wow, okay. I'd have small amounts of wine with dinner, but I think I was a teenager. Yeah, my parents would water down some wine. And among adults, rates of full-blown alcoholism are far lower in Colombia than in North America or Northern Europe, which meant that teenage binge drinking is not at top of people's concerns, at least not compared to hard drug use, like lacing a cigarette with cheap cocaine residue. Garavito also had genetics running against him. His father was a drunk and came from a family of drunks. And although his mother was a teetotaler, her father was also a relentless old soak who had died of cirrhosis of the liver. And she had two brothers who were also professional grog guzzlers. Yeah, that's not going to be good. Like, I don't know, no one in my family is addicted to really anything. So and I'm also like not really an addictive personality. Like, I'll do things once or just this. And it's like, yeah, with the drinking, I was like, okay, so I'll just stop. It wasn't like, oh no. It was like, for a couple of days, it was like, oh man, I could really use a glass of wine after work. But that quickly passed. Thus, Garavito was a budding piss artist from a long, ignoble lineage of piss artists. This made an occasional casual constrained tipple almost impossible for him. Yeah, that's my life now. It's like maybe a glass of wine or two once a week. And not even a big glass, like a tiny little glass. It's like, It still tastes great, doesn't it? I love wine. Garavito says that after the incident of him failing to become aroused by heterosexual pornography, he tried to quote-unquote correct the problem by sexually propositioning dozens of older women along with plenty of girls his own age. In order to summon up the courage and possibly the willpower to do so, he first needed to be thoroughly lubricated by alcohol. But his forwardness and confidence were counterbalanced by a rather off-putting and creepy drunkenness. Thus, the booze-reeking 15-year-old was always and unsurprisingly turned down by every woman he approached. Drunken carousing, however, became a permanent fixture in the teenager's life. Some of this was just for entertainment among his friends, but the removal of Garavito's inhibitions quickly led him toward the real object of his desires. In late 1972, Garavito, under an extreme state of intoxication, was caught by his mother trying to force himself on a 5-year-old boy. Oh my God, what do you do in that situation? You're like, you gotta stop drinking. What the f***? Garavito later claimed that this boy's fear and distress first ignited in him a strong impulse towards sexual sadism. It is like his brain is so broken. It's unclear whether this was the only boy that Garavito molested in 1972. It is just the only instance in 1972 where Garavito got caught. Garavito himself claims that the incident was a one-off, and according to Garavito, the act disgusted his mother and father, and he was thrown out of the house for a week or two. But the police were not called, and no charges were laid. Disgusted his mother and father. What a shocking surprise. In 1973, at the age of 16, Garavito continued his depredations. Again, the number of victims in this year is unknown, but we know there were several. He traveled widely, possibly to reduce the chances of detection. He was arrested at a train station in Bogota, 400 kilometers or 250 miles away from Trio, after attempting an assault on a 6-year-old boy. The assault took place on a train platform and the boy screamed, immediately attracting the attention of authorities. The brazen and sloppy nature of the assault can be attributed to Garavito's state of intoxication at the time. Garavito was charged with attempted sexual assault on a minor, but the case did not go to trial. Under police questioning, Garavito denied that he wanted to sodomize the victim, but just, quote, wanted to lightly abuse him. Bro, if you don't go to prison right now, you gotta go to prison. You gotta go to prison. You can't be just like, oh no, officer. No, I wasn't wanting to sodomize him. I was just there for some light abuse. Just some, just a splashing of molestation, officer. Meanwhile, the incident led to Garavito being permanently thrown out of the house, so that's going to solve the problem, isn't it? According to Garavito, his father, Manuel, did not object to the sexual assault in principle, holy but the fact that it was homosexual in nature. Manuel tried, son, it would be fine, just next time, assault a woman. 1970s. What's his name's dad? Manuel. Manuel chided his son for choosing young boys instead of women as his prey, or at least that's what Garavito later claimed. From there, the 16-year-old was thrown into the world of Colombia's many homeless young men. Some of them were recruited by paramilitary groups, some of them turned to crime, but most of them were exploited as a source of cheap labor. He first found work at a coffee plantation in Trio. It was while working at the coffee plantation in 73 that Garavito first met Luth Mary Ocampo Orozco, who was then a young woman living with her mother. Garavito and Ocampo formed a platonic friendship, although Garavito later claimed that he immediately fell head over heels in love with her. Their friendship was interrupted later that year when Ocampo moved to the small town of Cercazia to find work. This would not be the last time Garavito and Ocampo would see each other. In early 1974, at the age of 17, Garavito left Trio looking for better paying work. He bounced between the cities of Armenia and Pereira in the coffee axis, doing odd jobs until he found a position as a clerk at an insurance company. It was steady work and respectable, and in 1975, at the age of 18, Garavito even began taking night classes in marketing. Given his rough childhood, if Garavito was mentally sound and sober, this might have been a new lease on life, a success story, a triumph over adversity. However, Garavito's chronic alcoholism put an end to all of that. He'd show up to work drunk and aggressive, which quickly brought him into conflict with his co-workers and employers, even escalating to a few fistfights before he was fired. Thereupon, Garavito got a job as an assistant at a department store before he repeated the same pattern and was let go. From there, Garavito drifted back to doing odd jobs in various towns and cities, along with begging and selling trinkets on the side. Occasionally, he'd find a job as a bag boy at a grocery store before his consistent drunkenness got him fired there too. In his private life, things followed a similar pattern. Garavito struck up a number of platonic friendships with women and even formed a few romantic attachments. When drunk, he'd try to have sex with his girlfriends and sometimes even asked his erstwhile platonic friends, to varying results, mingled with trauma, shock, and horror. During the grim drunken sex act itself, he ran into the problem of unremitting erectile dysfunction. This doesn't seem to be the result of alcohol. Immediately I was going to be like, he's had too much booze. Instead, Garavito expressed frustration that he didn't find the women attractive. The alcohol was likely an attempt to overcome his lack of attraction rather than the cause of his sexual malfunctions. Hence, it seems likely Garavito was homosexual, not bisexual, but due to the culture and the times, he felt pressured to prove that yes, he was a red-blooded male like any other, and of course, due to the fact Garavito was drinking around his girlfriends, he'd quickly turn nasty and commit acts of verbal and physical abuse. But when he was sober, Garavito often seemed full of remorse, and his behavior toward his girlfriends was quite caring and tender. Nevertheless, the endless boozing gave these relationships a short shelf life. Garavito was unable to go more than a few days without getting hammered. This meant the women in his life were subject to recurrent threats, beatings, and drunken harangues. After enough of these outrages, the women always threw Garavito out of the house and spread word of his alcoholism and his abusiveness throughout the community. Thus, Garavito regularly wore out his welcome in a neighborhood, village, or a town and hit the road again to start it all again with strangers. The only thing that allowed him to stay in one place for a few months was the fact that he was very quiet and kind when he was sober, which bought him a little extra time with people before he was ostracized. Garavito didn't keep many friends, which is unsurprising for an alcoholic with ASPD. Antisocial personality disorder. I was like, ASPD. Somewhere police department. His closest confidant in life was his sister, Esther, the only member of his family he spoke to after being tossed out of his childhood home. Garavito would regularly go back to Trio to visit her, but even Esther, while sympathetic, tried to limit the amount of contact she had with him because of Garavito's alcoholism. Yeah, he also sounds like, he seems to be a total piece of shit already, so you just be like, yeah, no, I'm not going to hang out with you. Like, we're not friends, we're relatives. You don't choose your family. Even she had been on the receiving end of his drunken aggression. As for the rest of his family, Garavito held a deep animosity towards them. A constant refrain whenever Garavito was drunk was how he hated his mother and most of his siblings, and how he wanted to murder his father. He'd rant about it to anyone who would listen, and while we can never be sure that Garavito has told the truth about his childhood, whatever he suffered at the hands of his father continued to rankle and fester within him. The pattern of moving to a new town, befriending or hooking up with a woman, and then using alcohol to burn it all down to ruins and ashes repeated itself from 1974 to 78. It's unclear how many children Garavito assaulted during this time, but we know there were quite a few, likely into the double digits across the 4 years. Garavito insists at this time he was preying upon not just young boys, but young girls as well. This may be true, or it may just be another manifestation of Garavito's case of definitely not being gay. He also made use of child sex workers from among the disposables, the thousands of impoverished orphans who lined the streets and alleyways of Colombia, and Garavito was cruel and rough with them. His sadistic streak had already been unleashed. He would beat them, threaten them, and torture them. But to this point, Garavito didn't go so far as to kill them. That inferno was yet to come. The Beast at Heaven's Gates. In 1978, when Garavito was just 21 years old, his alcoholism had become so pronounced that he fell into a deep depression and had frequent thoughts of what YouTube obliges us to call self-deletion. Yeah. And it's like, oh, the amount of pain and suffering that he would have saved everybody if he'd just done that would be so high. As such, Garavito joined Alcoholics Anonymous, which had spread from the United States to Colombia in 1959. And from putting one's faith in the general notion of a higher power, it was just a short skip and a hop to joining more formal religion. A thoroughly lapsed Catholic, Garavito was brought by a fellow AA member to some services held by the Pentecostal Church, an internationally widespread Protestant sect with lively, elaborate ceremonies, rife with music and replete with miraculous faith healing and people speaking in tongues. Like, as much as I think like religion is mostly nonsense and like all of this, it'd be like, if I had to go to one, I'd be like, do you want to go to the Catholic one? Which is all like, I don't know, it's very boring, it's very long, all of this. Or do you want to go to the one where they speak in tongues and some dude is like, and now walk, my child? Then I'll be like, I want to go to the one with the tongues. I want to go to that one. That sounds exciting. All of this showmanship had the effect of reigniting Garavito's belief in the divine. But the biggest appeal of Pentecostalism to Garavito was the concept of being cleansed of one's sins and being born again. Sure, in Catholicism, one can confess one's sins to try and gain entry into heaven by charity and acts of piety, but some sins are a bridge too far and ensure damnation. Oh, really? I think there was, I knew the one about like murdering the Pope or whatever. That's like one of the unforgivable sins or whatever. Like you can go to your Catholic like priest in the box or whatever and like, Father, forgive me for I have sinned. I have murdered the Pope. They'll be like, oh, sorry, mate. That's it. Can't help you. You're going to hell for sure. The only official requirement for salvation in Pentecostalism is to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and to join the family of God. It was thus by a simple declaration of faith that a sexual sadist and relentless child predator hoped to enter the gates of heaven. He still thinks he's going to heaven to this day. He's not, because heaven's not real. And also, if it was, it's not where you're going. In addition, you're going to the other place, the place where the devil, and he'll be like constantly removing your skin, and you'll be like, oh my God, finally, he removed all my skin. And then you'll notice that all of your skin is back on your body and he starts to remove it again. That's what I'm hoping for you. That's why I hope that the afterlife is real, because that's what I hope for you. In addition to AA and Pentecostalism, Garavito approached the Colombian Department of Social Services, who referred him to a fairly rudimentary counseling service to talk through his depression and alcohol abuse. He underwent this counseling on and off for the better part of 5 years. Oh my God, Colombia, you've got like people running around on the streets who are called the unrecoverables. Undesirables, whatever it was, like just disposable children, but you somehow have it set up so that this guy can receive counseling. That's kind of amazing to have that at a time where it's like, oh no, what are those children doing? Oh, they're running around smoking crack and killing each other. Like, what the f***? Nevertheless, it should be noted that during this period, Garavito frequently fell back to the bottle, and he did not stop his predatory behavior against children. He also did not discuss his attraction to children, much less his crimes against them, with any of his counselors. Probably a good idea. And so externally, Garavito adopted a double life like most serial killers. But internally, unlike many serial killers who simply wear a facade, Garavito was torn by a genuine cognitive dissonance, where he could not reconcile his hopes for salvation with what he was doing to society's most vulnerable. This tangle of piety and self-justification is evident in all of his TV interviews. By day, Garavito would attend church services and was known by other parishioners to beat his chest out of supposed remorse during prayer. At night, having been cleansed of sin, Garavito would visit the local parks and alleyways and solicit the sexual services of street urchins or lure other, more unsuspecting children with parents in happy homes toward quiet, isolated areas where they would be at his mercy. Not that Garavito had any mercy to give them. In 1978, shortly after his conversion to Pentecostalism, Garavito relocated to the town of Circassia, where he got a job at a grocery store. It was there that he reignited his friendship with Luth Mary Ocampo Orozco, who worked as a cashier in the same store. Although their relationship remained platonic, Garavito claimed that his love for Ocampo continued to burn brightly. He even managed to stay sober around her and was gentle, soft-spoken, and kind. He told Ocampo all about his religious conversion and hopes for salvation. It was only later that Ocampo heard from Garavito's sister, Esther, about just how bad his alcoholism continued to be. The same blissful state of ignorance did not apply to the owners of the grocery store. After a few months, Garavito was fired for absenteeism and occasionally being drunk at work when Ocampo wasn't there. Thereupon, Garavito picked up sticks and moved to the city of Armenia, where he got a job working at a local bakery. I'm just wondering if I've ever been drunk at work. I mean, since I work for myself, yeah. Not like drunk, but I've had a beer or two at work. Like, if I'm like hanging out with a mate and we're doing some work together or something in the like late afternoon, definitely. But like when I worked in like stores or like had jobs as a kid, I probably was, but only the kind of drunk where it's like, oh man, I was so drunk last night that I'm still drunk now. There's a phrase that's like stuck with me forever. Like I remember, like, I don't know why this stuck with me so much, but it was in my first year of university. And I go to like, we had these seminars or whatever, and there's like 8 of us in this room with the lecturer. And a mate of mine in the class is looking a bit shiny. And I'm like, you're right. And he's like, yeah, man, I went out last night. Got really drunk. I'm still in Disneyland. Like just that phrase of like being in Disneyland, meaning like still drunk the next day. It's like solid, but you made it to this class, just still drunk. But no, I don't think I've ever been drunk at like regular ass work. Thereupon, Garavito picked up sticks and moved to the city of Armenia, where he got a job working at a local bakery. He finally managed to keep things on an even keel at that job. He did his drinking off hours, but he did not cease his predations against children, frequently visiting Valencia Park to solicit disposables who were as young as 9. Garavito continued working at the bakery until the early 1980s, when he showed up drunk and fought with other staff members. He was promptly sacked, unemployed, penniless, and soon homeless again. Garavito fell back into depression, and the self-deleterious thoughts returned. Additionally, he developed a case of bulimia. Already a relatively small man, only standing at 165 centimeters or 5'5 inches, he now became rail thin. In the spring of 1980, Garavito checked himself into the psychiatric wing of the San Juan Dios Hospital in the city of Manizales. This is where doctors found out that he was also suffering from paranoia and hallucinations. He was treated with antipsychotics. Most notably, in one therapy session, Garavito began to confess to his psychiatrist that he had a desire for children, but then he walked that statement back, explaining that he meant he wanted to start a family. The psychiatrist be like, oh, bruh, what? So, hey, say that again? What? Like with his previous therapists, Garavito ultimately decided not to disclose his pederastic urges. He was released after a few weeks and moved back to Armenia, where he got a job at another grocery store. While there, he charmed a single mother and hairstylist named Claudia. He was kind to her and did not interfere with her child. Oh my god. He's such a nice guy. He's really kind. He hasn't touched my kids at all. What a great dude. Everyone else is always touching my kids inappropriately. Garavito has gone on record to say that the first woman's company I actually enjoyed was Claudia's. This seems a little at odds with his being in love with Luth Ocampo, but who can expect consistency from a psychopath, a serial killer, and a compulsive liar? But the relationship did not last long, because Claudia had a somewhat mercenary approach towards men, and Garavito could hardly splash the cash on a stock boy's wage. After their breakup, Garavito intensified his predatory behaviors. Mercenary approach towards men. I've not heard it referred to that way before. She was like, I hope you've got money. During his rather generous 2-hour lunch breaks at the grocery store. Oh my, can you imagine taking 2 hours? I have lunch at my desk. Sometimes I'll go out and it's like 20 minutes. Like, eat as quickly as possible and then go back to my desk. 2 hours. I mean, like, I wouldn't know what to do. He would travel from Armenia to the towns of Kimbaya or Kalaka, which were both within 20 kilometers or 12 miles of the city. He'd drink cheap brandy along the way. By the time he arrived, Garavito would lure one of the poorer children from a marketplace or park, usually by offering them money to perform an odd job of some kind. Once they were in an isolated spot, Garavito would get progressively drunker and then sexually assault them. In addition, he would beat them and bite them on the limbs, necks, and genitals, echoing the assault Garavito claims he experienced at the hands of the pharmacist's neighbor as a child. By the autumn of 1980, Garavito had taken to torturing his victims with candle wax, burning them with a lighter, and cutting them with a razor blade. In some cases, he amputated one of their toes. Garavito also removed one of his own front teeth so that he could, according to him, bite his victims more quote-unquote effectively. At this time, Garavito assaulted and tortured but did not kill his victims. So how is he getting away with it for so long if he's doing this all the time? Is no one come forward? Are the police just like, oh, you're a disposable child. No one cares about you. We don't have time to deal with this. We've got other problems to get to, like everything. From 1980 onward, Garavito preyed upon an estimated average of between 15 and 25 children per year, not counting the so-called disposables, whom he solicited for sex and subjected to the same torture. I feel like we should definitely be counting them as well. Is it just they're uncountable because there were so many? That's insane. He's going to get out of prison. This is insane. This should already be life upon life upon life in prison. As a result, it wasn't long before his victims entered the triple digits. And here is a man who one day soon might be released from prison and who is fanatically confident that when he dies, he will ascend to the gates of heaven. I'm glad you felt the need to repeat that there as well, David, because it's just wild, isn't it? Agents of Evil. In order to minimize his chances of being detected, Garavito quit his job at the grocery store in Armenia, bought a simple wooden sales cart and set out on the road. He sold trinkets, religious icons, and occasionally fruit. He traveled wildly across Colombia in order to prevent anyone from recognizing him as a perpetrator or tracking him down. Furthermore, being a street vendor allowed him to hang out at marketplaces without drawing suspicion while he was on the prowl for victims. As for his sales, he only needed to make enough to pay for food and for booze. Garavito was okay with sleeping rough, though periodically throughout the 1980s he would shack up with a woman, increasingly selecting single mothers so that he could return to a place after being on the road and sleep comfortably under a welcoming roof. As a result of these tactics, Garavito was able to sexually assault and torture an estimated 200 to 300 children across Colombia between 1980 and 1992 without being caught. That's insane. And I don't know, it's like, I feel like all of this stuff should just be caught so much faster, but then it's like you still hear about stuff coming out, and you're like, wait, how many people? Over how long? And it's like, you think of like the Jimmy Savile stuff, and you're like, oh my god, how long was this going on for, and how many people knew? And it just never was dealt with. There was no punishment. He died before he was punished. He had this fancy-ass grave, and it only came out afterwards, so he never got any punishment for what he's done, which is sick. We can trace Garavito's probable movements in this period by looking at spikes in local reports of child abuse. Garavito's cognitive dissonance between his religiosity and his crimes persisted. When sober, he was frequently depressed about what he was doing, several times attempting self-deletion. At night, he would feverishly read the Bible, trying to find a stray passage that might somehow justify what he was doing to the children. He would also strip naked and hit himself in the chest in contrition. He began asking his victims what their names were so he could record them in a blue notebook, which he read while he prayed. Garavito claims he had frequent nightmares from which he woke up and cried before bursting into maniacal laughter when he remembered that despite his faith, his crimes had given him a great deal of sexual pleasure. His contemplations of God, the afterlife, salvation, and his justifications for sin were not abided by the fact that he frequently suffered from psychosis, delusions, and hallucinations muddling his thoughts. And then there was the booze, which was omnipresent and capable of quieting any depression or frustration with exaggerated confidence, followed by sweet oblivion. When scouring the Bible for a justification failed, Garavito leaned into the idea that he was pure evil. A natural first step was Satanism. Garavito indulged himself in black magic, seances to commune with the dead, sacrificial rituals to summon dark spirits, and the foretelling of the future with tarot cards. He visited occultists and fortune tellers until he decided that he knew more about the spiritual underworld than they did. Garavito began to believe the devil was speaking to him and sending him commands. This is not unheard of with serial killers. Jeffrey Dahmer began to believe something similar. It has a twisted form of logic to it. If an all-powerful evil being is sending you commands, then who are you, a mere frail mortal, to disobey? You could then indulge whatever sadistic or depraved activity that gave you sexual pleasure while acknowledging head-on that it was morally wrong. That's a super fucked up justification. It didn't need to be rationalized, justified, and it definitely wasn't your fault. The devil made you do it. Literally. In this respect, Satanism eliminated the cognitive dissonance Garavito had previously felt. Yeah, it's also just such a sign of mental illness. Or just an excuse for his shitty behavior. And I say cognitive dissonance rather than genuine remorse, which is a word that sometimes crops up in accounts of Garavito hitting himself, praying over the names of his victims, and feeling depressed about what he's doing to those children. The word remorse is also thrown around quite a bit in statements by Garavito himself, but it is quite clear from his interviews and published psych evaluations that Garavito is a psychopath, neurologically incapable of feeling empathy or true remorse. Instead, when we talk about Garavito feeling conflicted, we're talking about his awareness that what he was doing was against laws and moral norms. Being religious in a highly religious country, he knew full well the Ten Commandments prohibited murder. He knew that Christ preached a compassion that was the polar opposite to hurting an innocent child. He knew that hurting a child is illegal. He knew that a mob of people would happily kill him for what he was doing. His so-called remorse was entirely relative to how he was perceived. So in the face of his God and of Colombian society, he tried to justify what he'd done. And when he couldn't, he simply shrugged his shoulders, said that he was a sinner, and said, quote-unquote, that he felt bad about it. But he didn't actually care about the suffering of those kids. In addition to Satanism, Garavito added Nazism, mostly in connection to the violence it wrought rather than anything ideological or racial. He picked up a copy of Mein Kampf, various biographies of Hitler, and accounts of World War II. Why? Garavito connected with the fact that Hitler was once a homeless and impoverished artist in Vienna. He admired the fact that Hitler had gone from a situation very similar to his own to being a totalitarian dictator of a country and nearly conquering all of Europe. Garavito also admired Hitler's particularly ruthless and violent methods. He had a particular affection for the idea of shooting large numbers of people in mass graves that they had been forced to dig themselves. Oh my god, who reads books about World War II? It's like, you know what the really nice part about was that? People digging their own graves and then being executed by guns. That was so good. It's a really interesting part of World War II that I love. What's wrong with your brain? Garavito also recognized the quote-unquote usefulness of keeping Jews, gypsies, and political prisoners in concentration camps and was stimulated by the torture and misery inflicted there. What did we say? That this wasn't, it wasn't in connection to anything like racial or ideological? Don't know about that. This sounds a little racial, doesn't it? Of course, Garavito overlooked the fact that as a same-sex attracted person, he would have likely wound up in one of those concentration camps as well. Nor did the Third Reich look kindly on alcoholics whom they considered genetically flawed and whom they imprisoned, institutionalized, and even euthanized. But Garavito took no notice of that. Instead, he studied the likely untrue theories of some historians that Hitler was homosexual. To Garavito's mind, this brought them even closer together as kindred spirits. In similar vein, Garavito came to idolize Colombian mass murderer Campo Elias Delgado, an army veteran who got up one day, went to the bank, cleaned out his saving accounts, bought a revolver and 500 rounds of ammunition, and then proceeded to shoot, stab, and burn several of his neighbors before heading to an Italian restaurant, having a few drinks, and then opening fire on the other customers. In total, he killed 29 people and injured 12 before the police put a bullet in his brain. Garavito began to have fantasies about killing people in front of journalists and large crowds. He dreamed of buying a machine gun, going to Trujillo, and filling his father full of bullets before gunning down his mother and his other siblings, and finally turning the gun on himself. All this was wrapped up in Garavito's feeling that he was entitled to vengeance upon the world, and he wanted to take himself out rather than allow himself to be caught. He had all of these murderous fantasies before he killed a single child. Yet harming an adult was something of a daunting prospect for Garavito, who was short, thin, malnourished, and rather timid around people when he was sober. When the time came to kill, Garavito ultimately chose more defenseless victims. On January the 25th, 1984, Garavito got drunk, fell into a deep psychosis, and began to cut himself in public. He was locked up in a psych ward and put on medication. He was given cognitive behavioral therapy, aka talk therapy, for his depression. He was kept institutionalized for a month and was released on February the 28th with supposedly a clean bill of health. That same day, he went to the city of Pereira, where he abducted, sexually assaulted, and tortured 2 boys. Garavito went to his sister Esther's house, who was then living in Pereira, and asked her to store a small clothes bag. Unbeknownst to her, it contained 2 identity cards taken from the boys. However, a few days later, the victim spotted Garavito in public and pointed him out to adults, forcing Garavito to flee the city. Police were not able to identify Garavito from witness descriptions, and no warrant was circulated. Garavito continued to seek psychiatric treatment as an outpatient at various mental hospitals, occasionally being committed after one of his self-deletion attempts. Again, he never disclosed his crimes or pederastic inclinations to his therapists. He was also arrested by police in 1984 on suspicion of petty theft, but was released without charge. It was 2 years before Garavito was bold enough to return to Pereira. It was a large enough city that he was fortunate enough not to be recognized by any formal witnesses. Throughout 1986, Garavito continued to ply his trade as a street vendor, along with continuing to stalk and assault victims. He also shacked up with a single mother named Graciela Zabaleta, having randomly met her after leaving a mental hospital nearby her house. Garavito approached her and immediately suggested they become boyfriends and girlfriends. It's weird and bold. Although the directness of this approach could have had the exact opposite effect, Graciela was charmed by Garavito's confidence and invited him into her home. For the next several months, Garavito paid Graciela's bills and groceries with the proceeds of his street sales. He was also very kind and seemingly protective of Graciela's children. Erectile dysfunction kept sex off the table, but like Luth and Claudia, Garavito later claimed that he was madly in love with Graciela. His relationship with her managed to last longer than some others because he frequently headed out of town to stalk victims. This prevented Graciela from seeing Garavito drunk too often. For Garavito's part, he attempted to stay sober whenever he was in her home. However, by early 1987, Graciela had seen Garavito drunk, deranged, and angry too many times, and she asked him to leave. Garavito hit the road again. He began exclusively selling religious iconography, pictures of the Pope and various saints. He continued to lure children and assault them, diversifying his tactics by dressing up as a priest, a beggar, or walking with crutches to not arouse suspicion. And the worst was yet to come. Slaughter. After preying on between 200 and 300 victims in the 2 decades between 1972 and 1992, Garavito claims that he began to feel a, quote, sense of apathy about carrying out further sexual assaults. He also began to have trouble reaching sexual climax during these atrocities. The thrill just wasn't what it used to be. Then in autumn of 1992, when he was 35 years old, Garavito claims that he was communing with spirits via a Ouija board when he heard the devil speak to him. The Dark Lord supposedly asked Garavito if he would like to serve him, to which Garavito answered yes, and Satan allegedly replied, quote, then kill, and with killing many rewards may it come to you. A few days later, on October the 1st, 1992, Garavito was heavily intoxicated and staggering down the streets of a resort district just north of the city of Cartagena on the Caribbean coast. He spotted a young boy sat on the sidewalk selling sweets and cigars. Garavito approached and offered the boy money to come and perform an odd job for him. The boy declined. Because Garavito was thoroughly faced, he began to get aggressive, groped the victim, at which point the boy called for help. 2 police officers approached, pistol-whipped Garavito, nice, and then beat him severely to the point of bleeding, nice, and dragged him to the local police station. Police officers, they're just like, it's like you just beat the shit out of someone and be like, now we're arresting you. That's how policing works. But I don't mind. There, Garavito bribed the officers with his watch, a ring, and 1,000 pesos, which is only 50 cents in modern US currency, to release him without charge. 3 days later, on the evening of October the 4th, 1992, Garavito staggered out of a bar in downtown Hamundi and began following a 13-year-old boy named Juan Carlos. Garavito claims that the moonlight somehow filled him with a desire to kill, and he had flashbacks of his childhood and became filled with rage. Garavito began tailing Juan Carlos through a crowded market district, quietly dipping into a shop to purchase a rope and a butcher's knife. Then Garavito approached the teenager, offered him 1,000 pesos to do a quick task for him. The boy agreed and followed Garavito out to a railroad track. Garavito beat the victim, knocking out his front teeth, and then tied him up, sodomized him, and slashed his throat with the butcher's knife. Post-mortem, Garavito mutilated the victim's rectum with the knife and castrated the corpse. Then the drunken murderer passed out. Garavito claims that when he awoke the next morning, he began to weep when he saw the boy's bloodstains on his clothes. Juan Carlos's body was discovered 3 days later. Due to the fact that he was poor and such murders were common, his death was not assigned a high priority by the police. His death was common? This sort of murder was common? His body was destroyed. What the police? Or what the Colombia? On October the 10th, Garavito headed to Trujillo to stay a few days with his sister Esther. Garavito claims that at this time he was trying to suppress his homicidal urges, despite having now gotten a taste for it. By some twisted, drunken logic, Garavito tried to tame his murderous impulses by keeping constantly obliterated on brandy, thinking he would not feel any rages if he stayed so drunk that he could barely stand. Well, that's not how it works with you, is it? It seems like you only do these horrible things when you're out off your face. Of course, such a level of intoxication cannot be maintained for more than a few hours, and the alcohol merely exacerbated Garavito's mental illness rather than curbing it. Garavito claims that on October the 12th, 1992, while working in the nearby city of Tallulah, he saw a child walk by on the street and became so angry that he smashed the wooden crates and clay containers on his sales cart. A few hours later, Garavito spotted 12-year-old Juan Alejandro Peñarendia. Garavito lured him to an isolated spot with promises of money, tied him up, sexually assaulted him, and stabbed him to death. In the hopes of making the murder look like a ritual killing committed by some kind of satanic cult, Garavito sliced off the victim's fingers, thumbs, and toes. He then dumped the body in the Cauca River, which incidentally had the nickname the River of Death because of the number of quote-unquote disposables commonly found floating in it. After the murder of Peñaranda on October the 12th, 1992, Garavito no longer tried to suppress his homicidal urges. He was hooked. He took up killing full-time, literally. He unleashed the sort of hell upon Colombia that hadn't been seen since the days of Pedro Lopez. Because of the sheer scale of the violence, the failure to identify all of the victims, and Garavito's own failure to remember the precise dates of all of them, the record grows a little hazy moving forward. But by a rough estimate, Garavito killed between 45 and 60 children per year. That's 4 or 5 children per month, averaging at least 1 child per week. Garavito targeted the disposables and the children of the rural peasantry and urban working class. Due to the nature of Colombian society at the time, it was only if you murdered a victim in the upper or middle classes that police assigned some priority to the investigation. The disposables had no one to report them missing. The parents of lower-class kids did report their children missing, but very little was done. Pedro Lopez exploited the same situation in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador in the 1970s. There was also the issue of reporting a child missing if one of the Colombian militias or drug cartels was behind it. To do so invited deadly retribution. Thus it was the classism and inactivity of the police and the poverty and utter chaos of the region that were responsible for how both Garavito and Lopez racked up such disgustingly high body counts. Was Colombia considered a failed state? Were these failed states at this time? Because when the police is so unfunctional, it sounds like a failed state, doesn't it? In addition to targeting poor children, Garavito also had a preference for boys who were slim, neotenous, I don't know that word, look up neotenous. Juvenile. Oh, slow development. Brilliant. With innocent features. Essentially, the younger and more effeminate looking, the better. He also preferred to kill children of predominantly European ancestry, especially if they had blue eyes or light-coloured hair, rather than children with darker features and or native Colombian ancestry. That said, Garavito's victims spanned the entire spectrum of appearances. He ultimately was not fussy. Garavito's murder victims were typically between the ages of 6 and 13, with one exception being a 16-year-old disabled teenager who had lost the use of his legs. Garavito also murdered 5 adults who were accidental witnesses of his killings. He did not torture or sexually assault them or mutilate their bodies. Due to the fact that many children had no dental records, no parents to claim them, or otherwise too decomposed when their bodies were found, scores and scores of children could not be identified at the time. It took elaborate facial reconstruction and years of research to discover their identities, and to this day, 27 of Garavito's victims still have not been identified. Again, this is a dude who's going to be released from prison. That is insane, Colombia. Get your shit together. Do not release this motherfucker. Or maybe do, and just tell everyone where he is at all times. Just be like, hey, that guy, that horrible dude, he's right here. He's right here. Anyone want to, you know? Unlike the first murder of Juan Carlos, Garavito generally struck during the daytime, preferably in the morning, approaching victims in the marketplace or the streets. He would also lurk around schoolyards in the afternoons. His approaches differed. Sometimes he'd appear as a street vendor, a priest, a beggar, a schoolteacher, a disabled tramp hobbling on crutches, and he even disguised himself as an old man. In Trujillo, Garavito took care to gain a reputation in the local community as a charity worker who was fond of kids, a facade that he was able to carry off very effectively when he was soft-spoken and sober. It sounds like he should never have moved from Catholicism, to be honest. He would have fit right in there. Due to Garavito's large, low-hanging ears, the children affectionately gave him the nickname Goofy after the Disney character. The charity work gained him access to orphanages and other children's charitable organizations. Again, I know this is completely unrealistic for the time period, but if you're working for charities with children, they should police check you first. You should have that background check and make sure you're not on one of those, lists of weirdos. Regardless of the cover he used, Garavito would then make up an excuse to lure a child to a secluded spot, usually a job for money. If the child seemed hesitant to go with him, Garavito would increase the amount. That usually clinched things. Other times, Garavito would offer sweets or gifts, and in some cases, it offered drugs to street children who were addicted to smoking that cocaine residue. Once, on the morning after Halloween, Garavito lured a victim by offering to help him find the candy the boy had lost the night before. Once he had convinced his victim by whatever means, Garavito would then walk a very long distance with the child until they were too tired to resist. Then Garavito would strike. The attacks were sudden, but not quick, with prolonged torture that could last the better part of an hour. In 1993, Garavito escalated the brutality of the killings. He resumed the atrocities of his previous non-lethal attacks, the burning, the cutting, the biting. In addition, Garavito began disemboweling his victims while they were alive, and he was in the middle of sexually assaulting them. It became something of a grotesque signature of his. Such was the fate experienced by 8 schoolboys between the ages of 9 and 11 that Garavito brazenly lured to a secluded area and bound with rope in the town of La Victoria. He moved from one victim to the next, while the others watched. After it was over, Garavito severed the victims' toes post-mortem and took them as trophies, along with their pictures cut out of their identity cards. Garavito soon dumped the toes, however, for fear of being detected by sniffer dogs. He would instead document the killings in a little notebook, take photographs of the victims' bodies, cut out any newspaper reports of the killings, and keep the receipts and bus tickets of his journeys between towns. He kept these mementos in a black cotton bag at his sister Esther's house. Sounds like he's not just writing down his crimes, he's documenting his crimes. After the mass murder in La Victoria, Garavito traveled an hour north and used the same modus operandi to torture and murder 11 more victims in Bogota, this time killed one by one. He then departed for Tulula and found more victims and spent the rest of 1993 hopping between Pereira, Quimbaya, Armenia, and 54 other towns and villages, taking the lives of dozens of victims. By the end of the year, Garavito began removing a victim's vital organs post-mortem and taking them with him from the scene. He did not keep them as trophies, but soon discarded them at a second location. Due to rapid rates of decomposition and interference from wildlife, the viscera was almost never found. In 1994, Garavito added the torture method of flaying the skin off the victim's buttocks with a razor blade that he held between his fingers. On February the 4th, in Bogota, Garavito lured 13-year-old Jamie Gonzalez from the Plaza de Bolivar on a long trek to a sugarcane field. Garavito was already extremely intoxicated, having just been thrown out of a bar for flying into a drunken rage over the quality of the food. He continued to drink from a cheap bottle of brandy once they reached the field. After Garavito murdered Gonzalez, he caught sight of a nearby crucifix, which triggered his latent fear of God. Garavito panicked, buried his knife, and prayed for absolution, then dug up the knife again and went to a hotel, where he paced naked around the room for the next several hours, flogging himself and reciting Psalm 57. "Be merciful unto me, O God, for my soul trusteth in thee. In the shadow of thy wings I will take my refuge until these calamities be overpast. He shall send from heaven and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow me up. My soul is among lions, and I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword." The fact that Garavito chose Psalm 57 indicates his narcissism and lack of accountability for his actions. The passage features King David calling upon God to rescue him from the evils of the world, including the slander of other people. Garavito also saw himself beset by the evils of the world and beseeched God to rescue him, instead of recognizing that it was he, Garavito himself, who was the greatest evil of all. While still in Bogota, Garavito spotted a 12-year-old boy sleeping on a bus. He plied him with brandy and lured his now intoxicated victim into a ravine. There, Garavito stripped off the victim's clothes and began to bind him with rope. When Garavito detected the smell of rotting flesh, he soon discovered that they were standing next to a mass grave. Not one of Garavito's. This was Colombia. As Garavito recoiled from the smell, the boy seized his chance and grabbed Garavito's knife. The boy slashed the blade at the older man, slicing the tendons in Garavito's left hand as he raised his arms to protect himself. Ultimately, however, Garavito managed to overpower the victim and murdered him. The killing blow was usually a deep cut across the throat, while Garavito climaxed. Oh my god. Too much. Also, post-mortem, Garavito would castrate the corpse. When feeling particularly enraged and venomous, Garavito would place the genitals in the cadaver's mouth. Only 2 known victims, out of hundreds after Garavito's murder spree began in 1992, wound up being luckier in their escape attempts. Brand Fernie Bernal Alvarez was a 16-year-old who worked for his father running a cockfighting business. Garavito approached the victim, didn't try to lure him, but immediately threatened Alvarez with a knife. Garavito marched him into the forest and bound the victim with rope. He stabbed Alvarez 7 times with a screwdriver during the sexual assault. However, Alvarez was able to break free of the ropes and run away before Garavito could kill him. In Circassia, Garavito approached a 10-year-old boy named Carlos Alberto. Garavito offered the victim 200 pesos, roughly 10 cents in modern US currency, along with some small gifts, and lured him to a secluded, tree-covered hillside. The usual modus operandi ensued. At one point, Garavito asked the victim if he was enjoying it. The boy, hoping to mollify his abductor, responded yes. And so Garavito let the boy go without killing him, saying, quote, "That's how you like it. That's how I like it. See you next week." Jesus, how is he not getting caught? He's just one person escaped and one has been let go. It's just insane police incompetence, an insane failed state situation where it's like the police still don't catch him after he's had Jesus. By 1995, there were enough unexplained corpses of children turning up in the town of Armenia for the local district attorney's office to set up a 4-man task force. Excellent, let's go! The team began asking for reports of similar discoveries from across Colombia. Hundreds of reports flooded in. However, many of the children had not been identified, nor were detailed descriptions of their injuries given, making it impossible to tie the bodies matching Garavito's MO to one man. In that same year, police discovered the bodies of 4 children in varying states of decomposition in a hillside in the Cauca Valley. They were all from the lower classes between the ages of 8 and 10, and 2 of them were cousins. All of them had disappeared before noon, with the cousins disappearing on the same day and the 2 other children disappearing on different days. It appeared that once the killer found a decent spot, he would lure subsequent victims there as well, quickly subduing and binding them once they saw the previous corpses. Police also... Jesus Christ, that's got to be terrifying. You just be like, okay. But then you got to fight, right? That's it. That's all you got. You know you're going to die, so you might as well go for it. Police also found several empty bottles of cheap brandy and a bottle of lubricant at the scene. This is one of the earliest connections authority made of a killer of children stalking the region. The bodies all showed similar signs of injury and the same cause of death, a slash across the throat. The killer had also added the torture method of inserting a knife into their rectums. DNA found on the bodies indicated that they'd been sexually assaulted, but police didn't know whether this had been done pre- or post-mortem. Indeed, Garavito's usual MO was to assault his victims while they were alive, but sometimes when the victim expired too soon, Garavito engaged in necrophilia. Of course he did. Why wasn't he? Fucking psycho. State of decay. In 1996, Garavito was arrested in the town of Tunja under suspicion of the murder of a 12-year-old boy named Renal Delgado Quintero. Garavito had been identified by a store owner and several local sex workers who had seen Garavito lure the boy away from a crowded marketplace. However, police had no other evidence, and it was Garavito's word against the eyewitnesses. After some smooth talking and coming off as harmless as possible, Garavito managed to be released without charge. He immediately modified his appearance and traveled 450 kilometers or 280 miles west to Pereira, where he promptly murdered 10-year-old Jorge Ramirez after arriving. Jesus Christ, you're this close to getting caught. How is that not... I know eyewitness testimony is super unreliable, but can we at least keep a super close eye on this dude now, police? Come on. On the 8th of June, 1996, Garavito was in the town of Boyaca and approached a group of boys in a shop and bought them all sweets. He then managed to lure one of the boys away for an odd job, with the boy following him on his bike. The victim's mutilated remains were found 5 days later. Garavito was still in Boyaca at the time and was identified by the other boys. Garavito was arrested, and under police interrogation, he admitted to buying the boys sweets, but claimed that he left them alone after that. Again, if you're arrested and it's like you were buying children's sweets, put you on a list, not the big public list where you've been publicly convicted of a sex crime or whatever, but some secret police list that they just share with other police officers and share around the place and be like, yeah, that guy, we don't have much on him, but we think he's a sicko. So let's just, eyes on, chaps. Police showed poor judgment and released him. 4 days later, Garavito again traveled to Pereira, where he immediately tortured and murdered a 13-year-old boy. Then, in late June, Garavito moved to Circassia, where he ran into Luz Maria Campo Orozco, whom he had first met in 1973 and worked with at the grocery store in 1978. Garavito said he'd always loved Campo. She was now a school teacher and a single mother of a 15-year-old son. Garavito told her that he no longer worked for grocery stores, but for the past several years had been a street vendor and was now a salesman of air fresheners to schools across Colombia. But because the school year was now finished, Garavito complained that he was out of work. He asked Campo if he could stay with her. She consented. Garavito began selling fruit from a cart in the marketplace and paid Campo money in exchange for room and board. But his stay didn't last long due to his alcoholism. Locals in Circassia began to call him by the nickname Conflicto because he was frequently drunk and aggressive. By the end of July, Campo was eager to be rid of him, and Garavito moved out. In August 1996, while in Bogota, Garavito broke his leg. Now, it's unclear whether this was from a drunken fall, which is quite common with chronic alcoholics, or whether it was from a physical confrontation with an adult or an injury sustained while he was trying to kill another victim. Either way, it placed Garavito on crutches with a neck brace for the next month. During that time, Garavito briefly stayed with a male friend before returning to Circassia and begging Luz Campo to let him stay again. She cautiously said yes. Oh no, Luz, what are you doing? Don't be like that. You had to kick him out because he was conflicto. He spent his days begging on the streets, no longer able to work or kill any victims. He gave the proceeds of his panhandling over to Campo. In mid-September, when Garavito was sufficiently recovered, he went out and bought Campo a television and paid for it in installments. 2 weeks later, in October, Garavito was drunk again, and he got into a physical altercation with Campo's teenage son because Garavito wanted to put on the local news while the kid was watching something else. Campo kicked Garavito out of the house and had to assume paying the installments for the television herself. Bro, you can't do that. It's like, oh yeah, I got this debt and I gave it to you. It's like, well, I don't want it. It's not my debt. Why would you have to pay for that? It's like, so I bought you a car. Oh, awesome. Yeah, you got to pay the monthly payments. It's like, well, you didn't buy me a car then, did you? You got me a lease. Like, what the fuck? 2 months later, on Christmas Day, Campo had a male friend visit her and give her a Christmas present. Garavito must have been watching the house because that evening he made a drunken phone call to Campo where he called the male friend a gay slur and said that he didn't like him visiting. Campo responded by telling Garavito that he was banned from ever staying with her again. It's like, yeah, Garavito, guess what? It's none of your business. I've kicked you out of my house twice, Garavito. I was very generous. Don't tell me what I can and cannot do. And please don't murder me or my son. Thank you. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Garavito turned up at Campo's house, still drunk from the night before, shouting threats and peppering her with obscene insults. Garavito then attempted to strangle Campo. She and her son fled and took refuge in a neighbor's house. Garavito trashed Campo's place, stayed there several more hours, sobering up, writing Campo an apology note and then departing. Campo never saw him again. Shortly thereafter, in the second week of January 1997, Garavito murdered 3 victims, all between the ages of 6 and 8. In need of a new place to stay, Garavito rekindled relations with Graciela Zabaleta, a single mother in Pereira with whom he had first formed a romantic relationship in 1986. The two had been periodically in contact since then. Garavito paid her a visit in early 1997 and squeak-talked her into moving in again. He used the place as a base of operations while continuing to travel across the country killing victims. Thus, she didn't see him often, which might explain the relative longevity of his stay with her. The Garavito was also active in Pereira. For instance, on October 1st, 1997, he murdered 2 boys at a bus terminal. The next month, in November, police uncovered a dump site of 4 victims in a countryside ravine in the Risaralda region, not far from Pereira, where Garavito is based. The gruesome discovery set off a blizzard of police investigation and media coverage, which alarmed Garavito. Ultimately, however, the investigation stalled for lack of suspects. Then in February 1998, 100 kilometers, 60 miles to the south, police discovered the bodies of 3 boys lying on a hillside just outside of the town of Genova. One of them had been impaled on a pike so thoroughly that the sharp end had come out of the victim's mouth. Oh my god, you're doing some Vlad the Impaler now. This sparked another flurry of media attention, again alarming Garavito. In the coming months, he followed the news stories of other victims being discovered in various fields and forests across Colombia. In July 1998, Graciela Zabaleta had finally grown tired of Garavito's drunk and abusive behavior whenever he was home and politely asked him to leave. Garavito departed peaceably, but got Graciela to keep another black cotton bag at her house. There's no one looking in these cotton bags and being like, why are all these boys' ID card photos in here? What are these toes? Meanwhile, Garavito was convinced that he should move his murderous activities abroad for a while, so he bought a forged passport with the name of Bonifacio Moreira and flew to Ecuador. He spent the next 2 months begging for money. Locals immediately marked him out as a foreigner due to his heavy Colombian accent. In late July, Garavito murdered a 14-year-old boy and then a 12-year-old boy in the town of Choni, Ecuador. Then Garavito moved on to the city of Santo Domingo, where people made complaints to authorities about him lurking around a school. Unsurprisingly, given his usual victim profile, it's worth noting that this was a school for girls, which means either Garavito was branching out or deliberately trying to modify his killing pattern, or else he was actually bisexual after all. It's also possible that Garavito was lurking around boys' schools, but it was only his presence at the girls' school that had triggered local alarm. Either way, Santo Domingo police set up a sting operation to catch Garavito in the act of either molestation or abduction. Excellent! Where was this? Ecuador? Ecuador? Yeah, Ecuador's police got it together. Let's go. As he arrives, he's immediately caught. That'd be brilliant. And it's kind of shame Colombia a little bit, wouldn't it? However, Garavito must have caught wind of it because he fled the country. Shortly thereafter, Ecuadorian authorities discovered the corpse of a boy and a girl, both of whom had been killed with Garavito's usual MO. It's possible that the girl was an intended victim, or she was an opportunistic one because she had been in the company of the boy. Garavito claims that from Ecuador he flew to Venezuela, where he killed another victim before returning to Colombia in late August. Now unwelcome at Graciela's place, Garavito regularly began sleeping rough as he traveled across Colombia. And then, in November 1998, a mass grave of 36 victims was uncovered. Reports of other killings and mass graves began to flood in from across the country. A national task force was set up to coordinate the investigation. Finally, after years of police inaction, the hunt was on. And all I can say to that is it's about time. Let's go! Needle in a cane stack. On the morning of February the 6th, 1999, Garavito murdered 3 children in a sugarcane field just outside in the city Palmyra in the Cauca Valley. The usual modus operandi was observed, but Garavito was far drunker than usual. Really, he can get more drunk than usual? Wasn't he always just faced out of his mind? He had stripped off his shorts and underwear and was in the middle of performing an act of necrophilia on one of the corpses when he passed out on top of the body. He had a lit cigarette in his left hand. The sugarcane around him caught fire. The flames began to scorch his left side, causing 2nd and 3rd degree burns down his left arm, leg, and side. When Garavito awoke, he panicked and fled, abandoning his glasses, shoes, underwear, shorts, and some money that was in his pockets. A veritable treasure trove of forensic evidence. He also left behind the usual empty bottle of cheap brandy. Garavito ran along across the countryside with his arse and genitals exposed, hiding from people until he was able to discreetly steal a pair of trousers from a clothes line. He then hitchhiked, barefoot, and with his burns untreated, 190 kilometers or 120 miles north from Palmyra to Pereira to put some distance between himself and the now smoldering carnage. Yeah, you gotta be praying that fire was strong enough to burn all that evidence that you left behind. Like your glasses and your wallet. Like that's, they're gonna find you. Arriving in the early evening, Garavito staggered into a local drugstore and got some basic first aid. He then disappeared without telling the shopkeeper his name or what had happened. Garavito did not dare go to hospital. Back in Palmyra, the fire was put out by a local farmer and he discovered 2 of the 3 bodies in the process. Police found the 3rd body the next day, February 7th, along with items that Garavito had left behind. Oh, please put it together, police. Please, please, please. He's killed so many people. I just can't believe that it's gone on this long. The bodies showed injuries consistent with all other victims that had been found across Colombia, the number of which had now passed into the triple digits. The money found at the scene was discovered to have been printed and circulated in Ipaales, a town 485 kilometers or 300 miles to the south of Palmyra on the Ecuadorian border. This implied the murderer of the 3 victims in Palmyra likely traveled widely, same as the serial killer sought by the National Task Force. More concrete was the information derived from the glasses and shoes. The glasses had a left lens designed for a person with a specific type of astigmatism in his left eye. Oh, I have an astigmatism in my left eye. It was a condition that only occurred in people between ages 40 and 60 years old. Okay, maybe I don't have astigmatism in my left eye. Isn't an astigmatism, isn't that the thing where your eyeballs, like my left eyeballs, are slightly wonky shape? So my vision's not very good in my left eye, which is why I wear glasses. My right eye's pretty good. But it'd be weird to wear a monocle. Garavito was 42 at the time. What is an astigmatism? I really thought that's what it was called. Look up. Is it due to a rotational symmetry in the eye's refractive power? That does sound like what I've got. Okay, never mind. The arms of the glasses were bent downward, suggesting the wearer had unusually placed ears. Garavito had earned the nickname Goofy from the children of Trejo for this reason. The shoes, meanwhile, had usual patterns of wear and tear on them. Firstly, there was no erosion at the tip of the shoe, implying that the suspect had a foot smaller than the size of the shoe. Second, and most crucially, the circular wear patterns in the middle and heel of the right shoe suggested that the suspect had a limp, slightly rotating his foot as he walked. Indeed, Garavito had broken his leg in August 1996 and it had healed badly. Moreover, examination of the footprints found at the scene indicated that the suspect was between 5'4" and 5'6" inches tall. Again, Garavito was 5'5". And I mean, this is a lot of evidence, but unless they're doing the DNA thing, there's still a lot of people who are going to fit all of these conditions. Maybe not, actually. Astigmatism, a limp. Still, of all around the country, it's going to be really hard to pin that down. This information was relayed to the National Task Force. They pulled files from the archives of all suspects implicated in criminal activities involved, and thanks to YouTube censorship, a word that the first syllable is ped and the next 4 syllables are Ophelia since 1989. 5,000 suspects came up. Detectives immediately filtered out the cases involving female victims. All the victims found in Colombia were boys. They had not yet connected to the killer, the one girl found in Ecuador. Yes, it's a different country. Like, what are the odds? And he's traveling under a false passport anyway. This reduced the number of cases to 1,500. Next, the investigators excluded subjects that were under the age of 40. This drastically and shockingly reduced the number of suspects down to just 95 people. Oh my god. It would appear that 70% of the atrocities on file in Colombia were perpetrated against young girls, and that 94% of the suspects on file who acted out against young boys were below the age of 40. God damn, that's a statistic. It's very odd. When detectives filtered suspects for the height range of 5'4" to 5'6", the number was further reduced to 45 people. Okay, cool. Now we're getting somewhere. This is pretty great. It's good detective work. Finally, detectives focused on the suspects who had been implicated in sex crimes in the areas where the majority of the mass graves and dump sites had been found, namely the area around Bogota and the various towns and villages of the coffee axis. This reduced the list to 25 names. Luis Garavito was on that list. The suspect names were circulated to local law enforcement across Colombia. When is this, the 90s? Can't we just sample all of them for DNA and then take the DNA from the scene and be like, boom, easy, it's Garavito. Lock him up. Hang him. They don't have death penalty, do they? Because we know he's been released, which I totally forgot about because this episode is really long. One such investigator was Aldemar Duran, lead detective on the February 1998 case of 3 boys who were murdered in Garavito's birth town of Genova. Duran worked so tirelessly on the case, never taking time off and barely sleeping, that his colleagues nicknamed him the Killer's Shadow. Sounds like a right legend, to be honest. When the case exploded into a national investigation in November, Duran quickly matched the victim's injury, specific type of rope fibers, and the cheap brandy bottle left at the scene to the other cases. Since Colombia had no forensic psychologist who had worked on a serial killer case before, Duran contacted the FBI in the United States for insights on how to build a profile for a serial killer. That's cool. That's cool that they can do that. They can just reach out to the FBI and be like, what's up? What do you think of this? And the FBI do this. That's cool. He then got to know every snippet of information in the dozens and dozens of murders in intimate detail and attempted to put himself in the mind of the killer. Duran suspected that the man traveled around the country as a vagrant and so placed undercover officers in homeless communities up and down Colombia, paying no attention to jurisdiction. Good, it's time to ignore that jurisdiction and catch this face. Duran started researching the 25 suspects on the list circulated by the National Task Force. When looking into Luis Garavito, he found that he had been arrested in the town of Tunja in 1996 under suspicion of the murder of Ronald Delgado Quintero. Witnesses had seen Garavito walking off with the victim, but Garavito had been released due to a lack of evidence. But when he was arrested, Garavito had filled out some paperwork and listed his place of residence as Trujillo, where he had spent the final years of his childhood before being thrown out of his home. Duran found this interesting because mass graves had also been found on the outskirts of that town. Shortly after making these discoveries, Duran found out that Garavito had been arrested for a second time in 1996, this time under suspicion of murdering a victim in the town of Boyaca. Oh, this is it. You know you got your guy. You're looking, there's only 25 people that you're considering. Just go and get that DNA swab. Why aren't they doing the DNA thing yet? I guess they got to have probable cause or something, to go and get a DNA sample, but it feels like just go and ask them, and then some are going to give it. And even if that just knocks out 10 who are just giving it because they're like, well, I don't want to be in trouble for this, they'll give it. It could even knock out 15 or 20, and then you're just left with a few people, and then just watch them. Again, he was released. Feeling certain that Garavito was the killer the nation was looking for, Duran departed for Trujillo to see if he could track down anyone who knew Garavito. Meanwhile, close scrutiny was being placed on the city of Pereira because it was the first place where police had found a mass grave. They were conducting house-to-house searches, but found nothing. However, another name on the list of 25 suspects resided there, one Pedro Pablo Ramirez Garcia. He had a criminal record related to pediatric activity. Pederastic activities going far back as 1980. What is more, he was 44 years old, was 5'6", and walked with a limp in his right leg. Really? I guess the only thing that's remarkable there is the limp. But of the 25 people, 2 of them have a limp. He was also a street vendor and had been selling honey contained in old bottles of brandy. Oh my. The same type of brandy that was found in a majority of the crime scenes. Oh my god, Pedro, you are looking guilty as fuck, my dude, even though we know it's not you. Although you still sound like a terrible person, so whatever. This was all quite compelling circumstantial evidence. Garcia was already a suspect in the murder of 2 victims at a bus terminal in Pereira on October 1st, 1997. Turns out those boys had also been killed by Garavito. Then another boy in Pereira identified Garcia as the man who had tried to assault him. This was enough for police to hunt Garcia down and toss him in a cell. However, Garcia denied any involvement in the killings. Nevertheless, police were sure that they had their man. That is, until Garavito killed 4 more victims in Bogota, employing his usual MO. The police were troubled by this development, but they kept Garcia imprisoned as a precaution anyway, and because the allegations by the Pereira boy hadn't been resolved, that attempted assault had not been done by Garavito. Meanwhile, Detective Aldemar Duran was busy in Trujillo. He had managed to track down Garavito's sister, Esther. During questioning, Esther revealed that Garavito had left a black cotton bag with her for safekeeping. Uh-oh. Dude, they've already got you, and this is just going to be the cherry on top for putting you away for what turns out to not be ever, but just be 20 years, and now you're going to, be free, which is insane. I hope you listen to this and realize that everyone thinks you're a horrible piece of shit and you should still be in prison or dead. She turned it over to police. The bag contained documents, receipts, photographs, postcards, and various souvenirs of Garavito's travels between 1992 and 1994. Duran also found a box of notebooks in Esther's home, which contained a long list of children's names. Among the papers was a receipt for a money order wired to a woman who lived in Pereira named Graciela Zabaleta. Duran immediately made tracks to Pereira, where he interviewed Graciela. She turned over yet another black cotton bag containing even more evidence, documents, receipts, photos, lottery tickets, bus tickets, and newspaper clippings about the killings. But the bag contained something else. Synthetic fibers from ropes that matched those found at murder sites, as well as razor blades with blood on them, a couple of bottles of lubricant that matched the brand found at many of the crime scenes. It was pretty damning stuff. Police had a new prime suspect. Pedro Garcia, his attempted assault charge being dropped, was now released. The question was, where was Garavito? Neither Esther nor Graciela had seen him in months. Graciela's little black bag had led the police to the house Garavito was renting in Pereira, but when they arrived, they found the property had been vacated, and Duran's undercover officers in the homeless community had not found him either. It was as if he had simply disappeared, which is honestly a very smart thing to do because it's all coming crashing down for you, isn't it? Then, in the early evening of April 22nd, 1999, in the city of Villavicencio, Luis Garavito struck again. He had been getting drunk all afternoon on a bottle of brandy when he saw 12-year-old Juan Ivon Sabagal selling lottery tickets on the street. Garavito did not waste time trying to con the boy and immediately threatened him with a knife. He threw his arms around Sabagal in a pretend gesture of affection and dragged him into a taxi, telling Sabagal to keep his mouth shut or it'd kill him. The taxi drove them to the outskirts of town, where they got out, and Garavito forced Sabagal to climb over a barbed wire fence. Then Garavito ordered Sabagal to walk until they reached an isolated area at the top of a hill. Garavito forced Sabagal to his knees and tied his hands with a rope, while repeatedly asking him, "Am I a sadist? Am I a sadist? Am I a sadist?" Garavito then proceeded to hurl insults at the victim and wave his knife under his face, laughing at the boy's abject fear. Garavito then took out his penis and began to masturbate. It was then that a 16-year-old homeless boy spotted Garavito and Sabagal. Immediately recognizing the younger boy was in danger, the 16-year-old began throwing rocks at Garavito. Legend. Sabagal seized his opportunity, got to his feet, and ran in the direction of the 16-year-old. Garavito chased both of them, his knife out and at the ready, but due to the limp in his gammy leg, the two boys managed to lose him. If this isn't it for you, mate, I don't understand what would be. They passed by a local farmhouse and were spotted by a 12-year-old girl. Garavito wasn't far behind, saw the girl, and demanded aggressively that she say where the two boys went. The girl misled Garavito and pointed in the direction of the woods, where he got lost. Meanwhile, the homeless boy and Sabagal made it to a local car garage. The 16-year-old entrusted Sabagal to a mechanic working there and immediately departed, not wanting to be involved any further. The mechanic called the police at 7:15 p.m. By that point, Sabagal had been reported missing, and the police brought his mother to the garage to identify him. The police were in the process of driving the boy and his mother down to the police station to make a statement when Sabagal spotted Garavito from the car window walking by the side of the road. Sabagal pointed him out, and the police pulled over and immediately arrested Garavito. F***ing yes! Don't let him slip out. Look, we're what? 80% of the way through, 90% of the way through today's episode? This has got to be it, right? This is the end. Showing no emotion, Garavito identified himself as Bonifacio Moreira and denied having anything to do with Sabagal's abduction. The police did not believe him and took him down to the station. While this man named Bonifacio Moreira was being processed, police noticed that his signature was different on every piece of paper that he'd signed. Under questioning, the man continued to claim evidence. Due to the fact that the suspect fit the description of the Palmyra killer, 5'5", glasses and a limp in the right leg, the National Task Force was alerted. The suspect also had burns down his left side, which would have been consistent with the wounds the Palmyra killer might have sustained from the sugarcane fire. There's so much evidence, you just know you've got your dude, don't you? This guy. The National Task Force circulated the mugshot of the man who called himself Bonifacio Moreira to law enforcement across the country. When Detective Aldemar Duran saw the photo, he identified him as Luis Alfredo Garavito. But the man himself denied this and continued to identify himself as Moreira. Garavito was detained at La Tromacua, the notorious maximum security prison in Valledupar, for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and attempted murder of Juan Sabagal. Duran, meanwhile, tracked down one of Garavito's platonic female friends, Maria Umbar Toro, and convinced her to visit Garavito in prison while wearing a wire. During their discussion, Garavito told her that he had in the black bag of documents stashed away, which he had instructed the wife of another prisoner in La Tromacua to retrieve while she was visiting. Police located the woman and seized the bag. It contained more receipts, bus tickets, and children's photographs. There was also a piece of paper in the bag that later turned out to be Garavito's tally of victims for that year. Next, police arranged for Garavito to have an eye exam to confirm that he had astigmatism in his left eye, consistent with the lens of the charred glasses found in the sugarcane field in Palmyra. In order not to raise Garavito's suspicions, prompting him to cheat on the test, skewing the results, investigators got every inmate in the prison to take the test. While Garavito was out of his cell, police entered and retrieved Garavito's hair and samples of his DNA. Excellent, that's going to lock it down. I mean, the eye test is fantastic and all of that, but you've got enough circumstantial stuff. Just get that DNA test done and work out how many people he's killed, and then work out how to execute him, or don't, and let it out after 20 years, because apparently you're insane. Both came back as a perfect match for hairs and DNA found at multiple crime scenes. Next, police used the evidence in the black bags, along with police records and independent sources, to compile a history of Garavito's movement since 1992. It was an exhaustive process that took weeks, but the findings were that wherever police had a record of Garavito's location in the past 7 years, there were murders at the same location. All of this took from late April to early July of 1999. It was then that the police decided to confront Garavito with evidence in order to extract a confession. On July the 2nd, Garavito was subjected to 9 hours of questioning. He denied everything, including the fact that he was Garavito, so police sent for Ademar Duran, the killer's shadow, who knew the Garavito case in intimate detail and had made some attempt to understand the killer's psychology. Duran sat with Garavito for 18 hours of questioning, going over every scrap of information and piece of evidence, reconstructing the scenes of dozens of killings in gruesome detail. In short, Duran forced Garavito to relive the murders, which had a profound impact on him. Arousal, anger, even shame. Eventually, Garavito broke down in tears and began repeatedly screaming, "Why? Why?" at the top of his lungs. In the early hours of July 4th, Garavito began confessing to the murder of dozens of children in Colombia between 1992 and 1999, providing the dates and locations. The number of murders that he admitted to during his initial confession reached a total of 140. But that's not the total number. Not by a long shot. Triumph and tragedy. All things considered, despite years of police inaction and disorganization, it was a clever bit of policing that got Garavito caught. Much of the credit belongs to the work of Ademar Duran for identifying him and extracting his confession, but there was also a slick bit of police work performed by others, like the forensic analysts who pieced together the evidence left in the sugarcane field in Palmyra. The National Task Force coordinated with local law enforcement fairly effectively and imported experts and cutting-edge technologies from America, the UK, the Netherlands, and Russia got the job done. But here's where the justice system began to fail the grieving mothers and fathers of Colombia once more. Luis Garavito went to trial in 2001, charged with killing 172 children, of which he was convicted of 138. Neither of these numbers come close to the total we now suspect. Garavito was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. Now, as mentioned at the outset, due to a constitutional constraint, Colombian prisoners could only serve a maximum of 40 years of these sentences. Furthermore, due to the fact that Garavito confessed and continues to cooperate with authorities in locating more bodies, and the fact that Garavito continues to maintain good behavior while in prison, his sentence was ultimately reduced to 22 years. For perspective, that means David's going to give us like a number of months in prison, or days or whatever it is, per number of victims, for each victim, which is going to be crazy. For perspective, that means Garavito got roughly 2 months imprisonment for the sexual assault, torture, and murder of each of the 138 children he was convicted for, and roughly 3 weeks imprisonment for each of the children Garavito is estimated to have actually killed. And if we add into the equation the estimated number of victims Garavito sexually assaulted and tortured but did not kill between 1972 and 1992, Garavito got roughly 10 days in prison for each one of his victims. What 22 years of imprisonment means is that Garavito is due to be released in 2023 or 2024 at the age of 66 or 67. He currently has advanced eye cancer, for which he's receiving chemotherapy, and it ultimately may kill him. But it is unlikely to do so in the months before he is released. Therefore, it is incumbent on the Colombian authorities to negate the reward for his good behavior and the assistance he gave police, or to come up with a mental health or public safety reason to keep Garavito imprisoned. I can think of several mental health and public safety reasons. 1, he's probably going to kill people, and 2, he's not right in the head. But the ability and the willingness of the Colombian Attorney General's office and the relevant courts to do so is open to speculation. If Garavito is released, he says he wants to start a family, he wants to become a religious preacher, and he wants to go into politics to work with abused children. You should never be working with children, ever, let alone abused children. You should never be able to look at a child again. You should be kept in a small, solitary room which you can never leave. Or just executed. It is likely that if he is released, Garavito will come under intense police and public scrutiny. But here's the problem with having a mentally ill, psychopathic, sexual sadist and a word beginning with P and ending with file running amok. All it takes is one slip of vigilance or one instigating incident, and there might be another victim, or series of victims, left behind in his wake. The final possibility is that Garavito meets the fate of Pedro Lopez, who disappeared only a few months after his release. And like in the case of Pedro Lopez, that disappearance probably won't be created by the killer's flight, since men like Garavito and Lopez aren't able to stop killing and would leave a trail of bodies wherever they went, but rather someone in Colombia taking the law into their own hands and disposing of the killer's body where no one will ever find him. And that would be a terrible thing, wouldn't it? I'm sure the police will be all over solving that one. Be like, oh no, we'll get right on that tomorrow. Maybe. The sort of vigilante justice that prevails whenever the rule of law fails. And the rule of law has definitely failed the people of Colombia, including those hundreds of children who suffered and died at the hands of a monster, a man of incalculable evil who may one day soon walk free, and who to this day still believes he is entitled to pass through the gates of heaven. It's just ridiculous. Dismembered appendices. At the time of writing, 193 cases have now been definitively proven against Luis Garavito. Meanwhile, after his conviction, Garavito continued to make additional confessions. At present, the number of these confessions well surpasses 200 victims. And he isn't just making this stuff up. His confessions have sufficient details, dates, times, and locations to make investigators think that most, if not all, of these confessions are genuine. Meanwhile, in the past 2 decades, investigators have continued their work independently, following up on additional murder and disappearance cases. The total number of these cases exceeds 300 victims. Number 2. In terms of the number of confirmed proven victims, 193, Luis Garavito is the most prolific serial killer in modern history, something worsened by the fact that the overwhelming majority of his victims were children. The next runner-up is Pedro Lopez with 110 confirmed victims. In terms of unconfirmed victims, Garavito and Lopez are neck and neck with totals that both exceed 300 children. The other serial killers on that list don't even come close. Such were the conditions in Colombia in the latter half of the 20th century that allowed these monsters to thrive. 3. As mentioned at the beginning, I've observed quite a bit of social media activity, reaching out to the Colombian government through various channels, urging them not to release Garavito from prison. I cannot explicitly advocate for any such communications myself, but I am raising my eyebrows suggestively while I point out the fact that these communications are ongoing. Yes. What's that? Maybe you could be in touch? Wait, why can't we encourage that? Is that against the rules or something? Number 4. No fully comprehensive secondary source on Luis Garavito exists in English or Spanish, so this particular episode was rather difficult to research, cobbling things together from news articles, psych reports, academic papers, trial records, and so forth, some of which are in English, some of which had to be slotted into a translator. Many of the accounts are flawed and inconsistent, but I've done my best to verify the correct version of events here. Meanwhile, if anyone is itching to write the first big, definitive, not pulp bullshit version of a true crime book about Luis Garavito, there's a niche open for you. It is startling it hasn't been done already, since Garavito is arguably the world's worst serial killer. But in the field of true crime, we tend to overlook stories that come from the developing world and focus on the Bundys and the Gacies. Yeah, but this is just so much worse. I don't like ranking people. I don't like ranking Bundy and Gacy up against this guy, but he's possibly killed 300 children in the worst ways. Number 5. As a corollary of that, no major Hollywood production has even attempted to depict Garavito like movies have done with other serial killers, and given the nature of his crimes, I'd probably say that's for the best. And that's where we end today's episode. Thanks for being here.